If performance were enough, more women in tech would already be promoted. They're not. And the gap isn't confidence, capability, or ambition. It's executive presence. Today, I want to talk about what executive presence for women in tech actually means, why so many high-performing women are trying to solve the wrong problem, and what genuinely makes a difference when you're operating at senior levels. Because if you've ever been told you need more executive presence and felt frustrated, confused, or quietly deflated by that feedback, this episode of Leading Women in Tech is for you. Let's start by naming what usually happens when women in tech hear the words executive presence. It's rarely delivered with clarity. It sounds instead like, you're doing great, but we just need to see you operate at the next level. You might want to work on your presence. And what's missing is anything actionable. So most women do what high performers always do. They try to fix themselves. They assume executive presence means being more confident, speaking more in meetings, sounding more certain, polishing how we show up. And while none of those things are bad, they're also not the thing that gets you promoted. And I hear this so many times. I hear this on a, if not daily, certainly weekly basis from people coming to me asking for help. They've been told to work on their executive presence. They've tried something and nothing has worked. It's still there on their annual review, or it's in a bit of an informal feedback meant kindly, but it's so ambiguous. Or it's, will we promote you when? But the worst one for us as women is when we think executive presence means mimicking the men in the room. This is where executive presence truly becomes dangerous. Not because it's important, because it's poorly defined. And particularly when you think you've got to mimic the men, what works for men doesn't work for women. What is seen as confidence in men backfires for us as women. Their authentic behavior feels inauthentic in us, and that gets noticed. People will see your lack of authenticity and think, "Ooh, I don't like that." They won't tell you that it's because you're inauthentic. They won't be able to name what they're feeling, but they're feeling something. They notice. Here's the reframe I want you to hold on to as we go through today's episode. Executive presence is not about who you are. It's about how a senior leader experiences you. And those are two very different things. Now, here's the part that's going to be uncomfortable, but incredibly freeing once you see it clearly. At senior levels, performance is assumed. If you don't have that, you're not up there. Your results matter, yes. Your competence matters, absolutely. Your work ethic absolutely matters. But they're not what differentiates you, and they're not executive presence. What senior leaders are actually evaluating you on is how you frame problems, how you make decisions, how you handle ambiguity, how you prioritize, how you influence outcomes, and the most important of all, how you communicate this and the presence you have while you communicate it. In other words, they're assessing leadership presence, not output. And this is where so many of us as women in tech get stuck. We're delivering, we're reliable, we're carrying a huge amount of responsibility, but we're doing it in a way that keeps us in execution mode rather than positioning us as someone who can be trusted with bigger, messier, more strategic decisions. You might be trusted with delivery, but if you aren't trusted with strategic decisions, it's presence that's lacking, or at least a perception of your presence that's lacking. Because as women, we're more likely to have our heads down. Again, I see this all the time. We're more likely to focus on over-delivering quietly. We're waiting to be asked. We're waiting to be asked to speak up. We assume our work speaks for itself. We are often indispensable, but we're invisible at the same time. The number of times when I've heard of a woman who's left and then the company quietly crumbles. They didn't try and hold on to her. They didn't realize how crucial she was because she was invisible. She was essential but invisible. At senior levels, leaders aren't asking, can she do the work? They're asking, would I trust her judgment when the stakes are higher and the information is incomplete? Would I trust her in that situation? And by the way, Just because you've got women at the executive team, it doesn't mean they're any better at explaining any of this to you than the men are. I've often found that women can have great intentions, but they aren't able to discern what's going on here. Because when you have that judgment that means you're trusted with those higher stakes, that's executive presence. But people won't be able to tell you what it is that means you're there. And that's what I'm really trying to disambiguate today. When we get overlooked for promotion, it's really because we aren't capable. We are very, very capable. It's because our strategic presence at the senior level isn't being clearly signaled, even when the substance is there. And no, that doesn't mean forcing your opinion like some of your male colleagues do. It means sharing your insights, which, yes, can be uncomfortable at the table, but sharing them in a way that's right for you, authentically trustworthy you, the you that feels confident that you know the answer. It might feel uncomfortable to speak up, but you know the answer and you assert that. If this is landing uncomfortably, I want you to hear this very clearly. You aren't failing. This isn't a personal failure. It's not something to try and fix by trying harder. This is a shift in how you are evaluated. That shift has happened. If you are getting this feedback, the shift in how you're evaluated has happened. What's not caught up is you shifting the way you're operating. You can start working with it rather than against it. Now you know. It's time to shift what you're doing every day in terms of how you speak, how you hold yourself, how you make decisions, how you are in the room, how you speak up in meetings. It isn't about confidence or theatre or polish or personality. It's executive presence is signals that you send out. One of the things I like to tell clients of mine is the person who has the executive presence is that person who walks into the room and everybody pauses. Everybody takes a moment and just pays attention. That's somebody with executive presence. It's very hard to capture what's really going on, but there are signals that you're telling people. You're telling people with these signals how you think, how you decide, how you prioritize, how you handle change, how you handle discomfort, what you bring to the table, how you handle uncertainty, and you're calm with all of it, which is one of the reasons you have this quiet authority when you have executive presence, especially as women. I think some men get executive presence without that quiet authority, but for women, it's very hard. I have seen it. It's very hard to have the full executive presence, that presence that means that everybody just pays attention, trusts you in the messy middle, trusts you to herd them through change, trusts you when you make hard decisions. People follow you when you quietly, calmly do that. Men can be big and brash, but if you think about how you felt when you followed somebody loud and a little bit arrogant, let's just call this out, when the times are uncertain, you're sat there quietly second guessing. They often get away with it because they just go, but we've got to just go, right? The arrogance covers them through the fact that some of you are sat there going, do we trust this? I've been in organizations where everybody's having the conversation quietly. Is this the right decision? We all disagree, but hey, we'll go with it. Because the guy at the top has said, we're going, let's just go. But they don't really have true presence. They've got bravado. That doesn't work for us as women. This is where the bias kicks in, right? The bias kicks in. And if we try and use that bravado, nobody trusts us. Instead, we've got to come in with genuine, inner, deep-seated self-confidence. So though I said it isn't about confidence, you're going to have the self-confidence that I can lead us through this change, through this discomfort, through this ambiguity. We might not have the right answer because most of the time there is no such thing as a right answer. But if you follow me, we will be okay. Executive presence shows up in things like how you frame your work, not just what you're doing, but why it matters, what it enables. You actually don't have to talk about how very much. In fact, I would definitely say very, very little. And you definitely shouldn't be talking about the what. At the executive level, if you are there, the other people in that room do not care what your team does. They care than what your team delivers for the business. You need to frame your work around what you're providing for the company, not the lines of code or the marketing jargon that your team is currently working on. It shows up in how you own your decisions, not presenting options endlessly, but making a recommendation and standing behind it. You're only asking for final sign-off with backup information if they ask for more detail, yes. You aren't presenting, this is how I got to this decision. Here's the list of options I've considered. And then finally at the end, this is the one I recommend. You are going in with, this is what I recommend. Here's why. Let's go. You're saying we should do this because you don't bring your working, how you came to that decision at the table. You just bring your recommendation. You own your decisions. Executive presence also shows up in how you separate signal from noise. Let me explain this for a second. What do you elevate? What do you deprioritize? What do you do when you get pulled into things? Too many new and aspiring executives spend time on the wrong things. You won't last long, and you certainly won't get promoted if you do this. But no one is going to tell you what you should be spending your time on. In fact, we often spend our time on the desires of other people, so you feel like you're being told what to spend your time on. But unless you learn to separate the signal from the noise, what really matters to the business from what people are asking, and focus on what really moves the needle, you will not have an executive reputation. The next thing that I see a lot with those who have executive presence is their ability to manage energy and boundaries. Senior leaders aren't evaluated on responsiveness. They're evaluated on judgment. You don't, in fact, in my opinion, you shouldn't be working 24/7. And again, this is where our male role models lead us astray, because some of them haven't figured out how to separate signal from noise and focus on what matters. But because men have fewer caring responsibilities than we do, they're able to just work 24/7 and do all the things. It isn't actually that that's getting them rewarded. It's the fact they aren't doing what matters, but they haven't managed to manage their energy. And this only gets you so far. You'll have seen this with the classic I see in startups. They will do, but there comes a point where it stops you going any further because there's no strategic thinking. To make really good decisions, the best decisions, you need to make it from a place of energy and boundaries, not desperation and exhaustion. If you are going full belt, you will not make good decisions. You have to manage your energy and boundaries. Part of boundaries is learning how to say no to the stuff that is noise in the business. And the final thing I see those with great executive presence having is the ability to advocate for impact. Not self-promotion, but making sure the right people understand the outcomes that we are driving. This is why I'm so intentional about saying executive presence for women in tech is a skill set, not a personality trait, and what works for men doesn't work for women. You don't need to be louder. You don't need to be more corporate. You don't need to be somebody you're not. You need to understand how leadership presence is interpreted by those around you at the senior level, and then design the way you show up for that. And you can do that authentically. It might mean out of your comfort zone, but it doesn't mean inauthentic. Those are two different things. Sometimes it feels like if we're out of our comfort zone, it's not authentic. That isn't quite true. We can do things that are uncomfortable, but they're authentically us. They sit with our morals and our ethics and how we would like to show up if we had the confidence. When we're inauthentic, we're untrustworthy. We don't feel ourselves. We're mimicking behavior that doesn't feel genuine. That is not the same thing as confidence. Executive presence isn't built in moments of confidence. It's built in moments of choice. How you make decisions and how you bring them to the table. Now, we need to talk about why this feels particularly hard for us and deeply unfair, if I'm honest, for us as leading women in tech. Because as women in tech, we operate inside some double bias, some unconscious bias. Be decisive, but not abrasive. Be confident, but not arrogant. Be visible, but not self-promoting. Be collaborative, but still own the room, don't you know? And these tensions don't disappear just because you're getting more senior. If anything, they become more pronounced. And this is one of the reasons why women often confuse confidence with executive presence. They're told to speak up, be bolder, own the room, without any acknowledgement of the genuine risk that comes from being misinterpreted. So many of us respond by over-preparing, over-explaining, softening our language, people-pleasing, by the way, or staying just cautious enough to avoid backlash, which makes complete sense. But here's the critical distinction. Most executive presence gaps are not capability gaps. They're interpretation gaps. The flip side I see is women mimicking the men in the room, which also backfires, or we get sufficiently pissed off, which, by the way, I really get, because of the double standards that we stop caring. Either way, this all backfires. We're often doing all the right things, but in ways that aren't being read at the level we need to be operating at. And then when the feedback comes in vague, it's easy to internalize this as there's something wrong with me, or it's all just bias. I hear women going from one to the other. It's all about me. I'm wrong. I'm broken. I'm the problem. It's me. Or there's all this bias against me. So let's start with there's something wrong with me. First up, there just isn't, my love. There is nothing wrong with you. What's usually missing is translation between how you lead and how senior decision makers are interpreting your leadership presence. And it's all just bias. Well, this is where it gets tricky. And I'm hoping you just stick with me through this, because there absolutely is bias, but it's not what you're thinking. Yes, there's ageism bias. Yes, there's gender bias, but it's not playing out the way you think it is. Gender bias is often unconscious. It's very rarely, it's becoming more common sadly, but it's not as common as you think that it's explicit bias. But what it is two things. First of all, the bias manifests as you're less likely to be taken to one side and given some informal feedback. And secondly, you're going to be told you're too aggressive or not assertive enough. One of the two, rather than putting up with you. Men, they'll just put up with. They literally put up with them. It doesn't make it right. Doesn't mean they're good. But men are not given the feedback that they're too aggressive or assertive. They're forgiven for it. We have been told that men are being aggressive and they're applauded for it. That isn't actually true. If you actually speak to executives, they put up with it. Whereas women, we're called out for it because somehow it's okay to give us feedback like that, but not men. That's how the bias is actually showing up. So same with ageism. The unconscious bias is saying someone who's old is out of touch. But as long as you address that head on, you are bringing your experience to the table, which is extraordinary. And I've seen this happen. It's gone from interviews where there's clearly some concern to, we need this experienced person at the table. Now, why do I say this? Because I've seen it over and over again. We get so pissed off, excuse my language, that we just start showing up without caring because we assume it's about bias. Now, I wish that we didn't have to do this, but we do. And I really want us to understand that part of what's going on is men are far more likely to be given that informal mentoring. They're quietly taken to one side and given a bit of a pep talk multiple times in their careers, not once, but over and over and over again. Women, we know statistically, women are far less likely to get that informal nurture mentoring. We're more likely to be over-mentored with unhelpful advice about what to wear. Our career paths, the fact that you haven't ticked all the boxes that you should be, or why your resume isn't hitting the mark. We get over-mentored in the wrong things, and we don't get this informal, hey, the way you said that didn't quite land, here's how I would do it. Once you see all this, you need to recognize that bias is showing up, but not in the way you think it is. And therefore just being angry about it, well, it isn't changing anything. The goal stops being fix yourself and becomes design how you are experienced. Design how your leadership experience. Design what you want when you walk in that room. That's your turning point. And the more we do this as women, the more we're going to change it for every woman out there. Now let's talk about how to build your executive presence without changing you. I don't want to change you. You do not need to be somebody else. You build it by changing how you lead, how you frame yourself, how you talk about what you're interpreting, you're experienced by those around you. So let me offer you some genuine practical things you can start doing right now, today, next meeting. First of all, move from reporting to framing. I talk about this so much on the podcast. Instead of leading with what you've done, start with what decision is needed, not how to get to that point. At the executive level, they do not care about the how. They want to know the what is needed and why. What trade-offs exist. Not the millions of other trade-offs that you've worked through already, but what trade-offs exist that you know the executive team needs to know about. And then, or the team you're talking into. I know some of you are trying to work on this at a lower level, and that's absolutely amazing. The earlier you start working on this, the better. And then the third thing, what matters most right now, not to you, not to your team, but to the business. What is keeping you and your team awake at night is not what matters to the people in the room you're talking to. Slow down, take 10 seconds, ask yourself, what do they care about? Not what do I care about? Senior leaders don't need all the detail first. They need orientation. Then the second thing, practice decision ownership. Are you willing to say, based on what we know, this is the direction I recommend? Not because you're certain, but because you're accountable. The third thing you need to be doing is be deliberate about what you elevate. If you're like me, you probably elevated too much early in your career. Problem. I had this conversation just last week with somebody. Everything is urgent because it feels like it. Nothing is raised strategically. It's all just mess. Now, it might feel strategic to you, but other people are just hearing noise, pain, discomfort. You think everything we're doing is broken. Presence is about thought, knowing what to amplify as you do that. The fourth thing I want you to be doing, pay attention to your energy and boundaries. This is a big one if you are overextended and overwhelmed. Being constantly available can actually dilute your leadership presence. I love to get new executives that I work with to have a plan of not responding really quickly to their team. When you do that, your team actually solve more problems, but other executives as well will respect your boundaries. Being constantly available doesn't make you a great executive. What you want to show is you have great judgment, not super responsiveness. I was actually working with the CMO last year. She actually got the feedback from the CEO that she responded too quickly rather than thoughtfully. I've never had a CEO tell an executive that before that I've been coaching. I wish they said it more often because she was like, I thought I had to be in there all the time because everybody else is. Clearly, that is not what the CEO needed. He needed a really thoughtful response rather than 10-second later response. And the final thing I want you to be thinking through this week, rethink your self-advocacy. Executive presence isn't about self-promotion. It's about ensuring your impact is visible at the right altitude. You're not saying, look at me. You're saying, here's what this enables. And that's how executive presence skills get built. Quietly, intentionally, over time, you're speaking up about the work you're doing, the impact it's having, not the what, the how, the minor decisions you're making along the way. And you're speaking up clearly. Not because you're self-promoting, but because you've got stuff that team needs to hear. Once you stop trying to perform with confidence and start designing the experience the other people are going to have by you being in the room, things will shift. So let me just recap what I want you trying this week. Next meeting, move from reporting to framing what you're talking about. Practice decision ownership. Be deliberate about what you bring to the table, what you elevate. Pay attention to your energy and boundaries. And finally, rethink how you self-advocate. Here's something I want you to hear really clearly, especially if you're a high performer, which most of you are if you're listening to this. If executive presence feels vague or hard to pin down, that's not because you're missing something obvious. It's because this stuff is rarely taught and taught well. Or it's taught to men, and we're supposed to do the same thing, which does not work. Most women leaders only get feedback at the point where it's already holding them back. And even then, it's too abstract to act on. It's so many things. It's big. It's amorphous. There is no one thing. It's how you show up in its totality. If you try and fix this alone, it can be super frustrating. You're inside your own patterns in your own head. You're responding to a system you did not design and you don't necessarily understand, and often designed by men. You're often receiving feedback from people who feel something isn't quite landing but can't articulate why, or you're not landing offers in the job hunt and it's kind of vague feedback, or it's pointing at something you're like, but I'm kick-ass at that, or you didn't even ask me about that in the interview. That's where my support can be useful. Not because you need fixing, but because having a skilled external perspective helps you see how your leadership is being read, where your strengths are being under-signaled, and what small shifts will have a disproportionate impact. And this is exactly the work I do, and also what I talk about here on the podcast. So by all means, go and have a look at more episodes on this podcast. But if this episode resonated with you and you want support building your executive presence in a way that actually works in your organization, book a free strategy call with me. It costs you nothing, just an hour of your time. We sit down, we have a chat, and we go through and figure out what is and isn't working. Go to tonicollis.com/let's-chat or head to the show notes for that link. And whether or not you do that, I want to leave you with this. Executive presence isn't a mystery. It isn't reserved for a certain type of personality. And it definitely isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's a skill set that you can learn. And like any skill, you will build it. Bye for now.